I can work like a normal kind of desk job, but I really like the fantasy football. So let me actually make it a priority to put time into it and start taking it seriously and see kind of how far I can bring this.
It's cool to see, some young blood, some fresh blood in there, man. I celebrated my birthday yesterday, and I'm at the age now where I don't necessarily look forward to getting another year older, because it's just, I feel the age now. Like I look at the number and I'm like, man, this is bizarre. And then I realize that I'm just torturing myself by having you on late round perspectives today on the opposite side of the spectrum, where you're still hanging out, man. You get to celebrate all those birthdays. You don't have to worry about getting another year older. But it's great to have you on, man. I'm really, really excited to chop it up. Like a lot of the data folks that I've had on over the last year or so, whether it's Dwayne McFarland or whomever, sometimes the show sheet that I send, we go in a lot of different directions. So hopefully you're cool with that.
Yeah, no, of course. Whatever you end up wanting to talk about, but yeah, happy birthday. I do feel you on the age thing though. Like I'm 25 right now. It's getting to the point where I'm close to like calling NFL players that are the same age as me. Like, they're getting close. Yeah. I don't know, a couple more years in their primes. Like it's really going to hit once I'm like 28, 29. And I'm start saying like, oh, well, this running back, he's about to hit the age cliff, just like me, apparently, because we're the same age.
Trust me, it only gets stranger. I'm writing the prospect guide right now, and I turned 37 yesterday, and I'm writing the prospect guide, and I'm like calling, Trey Harris old for being a wide receiver prospect. He's 23. I mean, the dude is like, yeah. When I was 23, I felt invincible. Like nothing. Now I get the stomach flu earlier this week and over the weekend, and I'm just down for days. I can't even recover normally. So yeah, man, I mean, it's definitely a nice little wake up call. So I feel you with the 25 thing, but give me a break. You're 25. You're fine.
I guess it's not so bad. Yeah. Definitely puts it in perspective.
Yeah, right. Look, I like to open up with guests, especially folks who I haven't like talked to one-on-one like this before. Talk to me about you and again, how you're doing what you're doing right now. You've been crushing it, like I said. Lots of awesome content. I love to consume it, whether it's your tweets or some of your articles and stuff over on Fantasy Points. So talk to us about your background a little bit and what got you into fantasy football and how you now are with Fantasy Points doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so kind of how I first got into fantasy football was just having a league with a bunch of my high school buddies. I was probably like 15 or 16 when I first kind of really started getting into it. And how I guess first kind of got into the fantasy content and writing and all of that was, I don't know if high schools still do this, they probably should. But my senior year of high school, I had to do basically a senior project. So what they would say was you have to learn a new skill or spend like a certain number of hours on something you've never done before. And my like senior project was I wrote a very bad blog of doing like waiver wire picks in this would have been like 2017, 2018, around there. So I was just like posting them to the fantasy football subreddit, had a lot of fun with it, got like decent responses. Again, guys, please don't Google this. They're really bad. I don't want anyone reading that stuff. But yeah, I just kind of fell in love with it and it took off from there. Really after I graduated college with like a marketing and economics degree, I was like, you know what? This stuff is fine. Like I can work like a normal kind of desk job like this and it's okay, but I really like the fantasy football stuff. Let me actually like make it a priority to put time into it and start taking it seriously and see kind of how far I can bring this. And eventually my work got in front of Scott Barrett. And it kind of went from there. Like he really took me under his wing, made me a much, much better writer than I ever was before. And And yeah, over at Fantasy Points, they basically needed content and promotion, and just like breakdowns of a lot of the new stats that they were creating, like through the Fantasy Points data suite. So yeah, it was kind of a perfect fit. It just worked out really well, for both me and them, I think.
Yeah, first off, this is like it's so cool to see this kind of thing happen where I started at Number Fire back in 2013, and Barrett was one of the, maybe like one of the first 20 or so freelance writers, because we had a ton of freelance writers at the time and people would come and go, all that kind of stuff. And Barrett was one of the first probably 15 to 20 writers that we had that I'd brought on. And like, it's cool to see. Like, I was helping Barrett out a little bit. He had talked about it on Perspectives before too, which is why I'm okay with talking about it here. But I had helped Barrett a little bit. And then there was this one article that he wrote where everything just really started clicking for him. And then he just like rocket shipped. But it's awesome that like now he's helping you out in that way. That's what's so awesome about this space, man. You just see folks, just coming up and helping one another. And like, we all are technically competitors in a way, but it's not really that way at all. We're all buddies, and this is just like these conversations that I have on Perspectives. I really want to have them as if we were sitting together and anyone could be sitting there with us and just having these conversations. This one's going to be nerdier than a lot of them, but having these conversations, I think it's important for people to see that side a little bit more, and just like the conversational pieces as opposed to like bullet item 1, bullet item 2, and just going one by one on a list, talking about different players and stuff. I think it's important to kind of peel back that initial layer and open things up a little bit for folks to see the process side a little bit more. And I'm interested in yours a little bit. You did a great piece on 2024 fantasy football takeaways, and we're going to get to a lot of the stuff that's in that article, because I think it just breaks down the season really well. There's a lot of stuff I want to ask you about. But first, I do want to talk a little data. I kind of do this with a lot of the data analysts that hop on. But I'm not as interested in what you think people are doing right and well, across the space, whether it's an analyst or whether it's the way that a fantasy manager might be consuming data and using that and acting on it. I'm more concerned with what you think people get wrong, because when we can learn a lot more from that as opposed to the other side of things. So when you look at data in fantasy football, if there's a handful of things, one or two or just one, that you think folks just generally get incorrect and get wrong and practice incorrectly, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing, and this is both from like an analyst perspective and also like a consumer perspective, how people will read and consume content. I think everybody kind of wants a skeleton key stat, like just one stat that tells you everything you need to know, that just makes a decision for you. That doesn't exist. Like, every stat is a tool in your toolbox. It can tell you something limited about a player, but it can't tell you everything about a player, right? And that seems to be some people's standard is, well, a stat is useless if it doesn't account for all of the possible context, right? Like yards per out run, because it doesn't like take into account quarterback play or target competition, like it's a useless stat. Who cares? No, it's still a useful stat. We can still use it. You just, as an analyst, you have to account for all of the context. And as a consumer, you need to understand not just like, oh, this stat is good, so the player is good, but like, what is it? Or at least try to think about or see if the analyst is explaining to you, why does this stat matter? What is it actually telling us about this player? And how does it actually advance my argument? I guess that's kind of a pet peeve for me, is that people look at data like it's supposed to be a magic trick, basically. But no, it's a tool in the toolbox. It's a piece of an argument.
Yeah, 100%. I think that really rings true with projections, and that people think that projections are a system that you hit a button and all of a sudden you have your 2025 projections all finished and laid out and you're good to go. When the reality is there's an insane amount of subjectivity that's involved, with those projections. There's an insane amount of subjectivity that's involved in anything data related to a degree, because you're when we're telling stories and you're looking at a breakdown of some sort, you have to set certain parameters that you think are logical, as opposed to, you can't just look at every single player in every single instance and just say, this data point, like for instance, in my prospect model, I include every running back and wide receiver that was either at the NFL Combine or who was drafted, which usually they went to the NFL Combine, since 2011, right? So I'm working within these parameters. So like a guy like Austin Eckler, Adam Thielen, they're not in my prospect model, right? But I'm at least working within parameters that make sense, and I'm able to sort of construct these stories and look at these data points in a more actionable way, because I know what these parameters are that I'm working under. Similar to if we're looking at something like yards per route run, like you said, I think it's important that we state what those parameters are that we're looking at, because not only that, but and maybe I should just get to this right now, because we can skip around a little bit, but you sent a tweet out earlier this week about the importance of draft capital when prospecting. And so I want to ask you about the main points there, but one of the things you talked about in that tweet was the R squared, and you were looking at, and I saw some people commenting being like, I don't know what R squared is and all this kind of stuff.
I'm sorry, when people comment that, I'm like, oh, I failed here clearly, and
yeah, me too. I feel the same way.
It's nothing on those people. Yeah.
Yeah, and people say that to me all the time with my podcast, where I'm like repeating things, and they're like, "Why do you repeat things all the time?" I'm like, because I want to make sure everyone is getting the information that they need to get, and I will repeat the most important information. But yeah, I mean, like not everyone should know what R squared is or understand intuitively what that means. But what folks don't really realize and comprehend with something like R squared is that your sample that you're digging out of can change R squared completely, right? Like when someone comes to me and they say, what's the R squared of your model versus what you're measuring against, right? So I measure against best 2 seasons, which is the best 2 seasons averaged out over a player's first 3 years of his career. And so I'm measuring that against the model score. And I also measure that against draft capital to make sure that I want to be way better than draft capital, or else what's the point, right? Because we could just look at draft capital and just go one by one and pick these guys off, right? And so they asked me, what's the R squared? Well, no matter what the answer I give you, it doesn't matter, because there's no context for what that means. Like I could give you an R squared that is 0.95. It's 95% R squared if I'm looking at the proper sample that would help my argument, right? But my sample, like I said, is everyone since 2011 that was either drafted or went to the combine. So I do want to ask you, though, with that in mind, you did bring up R squared in that tweet, and you talked about the importance of draft capital. What made you send that tweet out, and why do you think it's so important? What are some of the main points that you wanted to get across?
Yeah, so I wasn't planning to get into this, but since we're talking about R squared, let's do it.
Let's do it, man.
Yeah. So my kind of main point with that tweet was, look, NFL teams are generally pretty good at what they do in scouting players. And also they're incentivized to look like they're right? They want players, especially running backs that they drafted highly, to like get a lot of production, to play a lot, right? They're naturally going to give these players a lot of chances. So us as analysts, if our job is we want to be as correct as possible in terms of who's going to score fantasy points, then we should be using that information. If that's like our single best data point for predicting a running back's production, or a wide receiver or a tight end or any player, then yeah, like I'm going to use it. I'm not going to, I think like one thing I do pretty well is understanding what I understand and knowing what I don't know. I'm not good at looking at a running back's tape and breaking down all of his traits and saying, this is what's going to lead to NFL success and this is what's not, right? Like full disclosure, no one should ever be taking film takes from me as like anything particularly seriously, compared to all the incredibly smart people in the industry that do that, right?
Yeah.
But what I can do is I can look at the R squared of draft capital versus like any combine athletic measurable, for example, and say, okay, clearly teams are taking a lot of this into their evaluation, and just knowing where the running back is drafted goes a much longer way toward telling us how many fantasy points he's likely to score in wherever you're targeting. I like to do the best of their first 3 seasons if we're talking about like dynasty value. But yeah, kind of getting into like the nerdy stuff with the R squared. My point in that tweet was the R squared for a running back's draft capital, like to the best of their first 3 seasons of production, was actually higher than the typical R squared you're going to get from a running back's fantasy points per game from year to year. Now, of course, those are different samples. They're different things that we're kind of testing, right? It's year to year stability versus projecting out over 3 years. But just knowing that and having that comparison in our head, that should make us think like, man, if draft capital is more predictive of production than a season of actual production, we should really care about this draft capital thing probably, right? So that's kind of where I was hoping to push it. And I really think that the best like analysis you can do around prospects is it either needs to heavily take draft capital into account, or you need to be purposefully looking for where you think the holes are in the predictiveness of draft capital. So, for example, in fantasy and PPR leagues, we care a lot more about running back pass catching than an NFL team drafting a running back necessarily is going to, right? We also see very consistently NFL teams just love drafting really speedy wide receivers, even if they have never shown an ability to command volume in college. We might call them like a better in real life archetype of receiver, right? They take the top off a defense. That doesn't mean that they're going to be really useful fantasy assets, right? Even if they're drafted highly. So just kind of looking for ways that draft capital, because it's targeting something different, right? For NFL teams, they just want useful real life players, as opposed to us in fantasy. We want our volume and our targets and all of that. So yeah, just kind of looking for ways that draft capital doesn't get the whole picture, I think, is how a lot of analysis should be framed right now.
Yeah, I love that answer. And you know, to anyone who is kind of lost about the R squared stuff, quite simply, you can just think of R squared of how much of this explains this, essentially. And so, you know, an R squared of 1 means it explains it perfectly. An R squared of 0 means that it doesn't explain it at all. And in football, you know, in your day-to-day like office job, you're gonna find, especially if you're in like some sort of manufacturing job or an engineering job of some sort, like supply chain type, you need to be very, very accurate. You need to be very, very efficient. And I mean, you ideally would be with football, but it's just impossible. So, you know, your R squareds, if you're working with like R squared in an office space, they're going to be 0.95, you know, 95% or higher. Whereas with football, when we get a metric, you know, again, this all depends on the sample that we're looking at, but like we're fist pumping whenever we get 40%, you know, 0.4 to 0.5 type R squared. Like that's a really, really big deal when it comes to like a metric of some sort. Again, that's all shifted and changes based on your sample. Like I was saying earlier, like for instance, you know, my sample will get, or my model will get less predictive when I take out all of the undrafted players. And that's because all of the undrafted players are mostly just bad in fantasy football. When they're in the sample, that increases my R squared because the model is becoming more predictive, because it's saying, hey, you went undrafted. I know you're probably not going to be very good. You know, Jalen Coker's aside. And so, you know, it's an important thing to grasp, like that sample size thing. But quite simply, it's just how much of this explains this. And I love what you're saying about draft capital, though, because to me, it seems almost just arrogant and ignorant in a way to ignore draft capital if you're doing that with, especially if you're doing data analysis and ignoring it, when we're thinking about it from the perspective of how can we create something that's going to be really actionable for not just the people reading, but for ourselves, right? Like we want to, like I started building a prospect model because I wanted to be better at understanding prospects and drafting and rookie drafts and stuff, right? And so I'm asking myself, how can I be better at doing that? Well, 99% of rookie drafts, if not more, are going to happen after the NFL draft is over. But now there's a ton of great resources out there like NFL Mock Draft Database where, you can look at projected draft capital and input that. And my experience, this is all anecdotal, but my experience with that has been it's you're going to get like the random Troy Franklins last year where people thought he was going to be a second rounder and he goes in the fourth round. You're going to get that happening at times, but generally speaking, it's pretty on point. And I would also argue, this is another thing, I actually want to throw this your way and see what your thoughts are. This is a completely subjective, like there's no right answer to this, but part of me thinks that, and I haven't tested it because the data isn't as robust, but like part of me thinks that using an NFL mock draft database, more of the herd mentality angle of draft capital, using that might be more predictive than draft capital itself, because draft capital itself uses only one team's input at the end of the day, right? Good example of this is Andy Isabella. No one expected Andy or Tutu Atwell, either one of those guys. Those guys go in the second round. No one really expected that to happen for the most part. And so, but it was one team that said, hey, we want to get our guy. We're going to reach, quote unquote reach. But I say reach because there were hundreds, if not thousands of analysts and probably lots and lots of teams that didn't have that same grade on that player. And so part of me wonders genuinely, if anyone out there wants to research this and get back to, because I would love to just use that data instead of draft capital, but would an NFL mock draft database or any of these other resources, would that draft capital maybe even be more predictive than draft capital itself because of that?
Yeah, that's super interesting to think about. There's definitely like a sort of a wisdom of the crowds element to that. Where you're right. If the pre-draft like draft capital expectation is just capturing more of people's opinions and takes and expectations, then maybe that is better. I guess it's the same reason that like Howie Roseman has built a juggernaut of a team just drafting off of like the consensus board that makes Twitter love him every draft, right? It's a similar idea. I'd be really interested in that. I wouldn't be that surprised if it was similarly or more predictive.
Yeah, and like I have to really stress that like I use NFL mock draft. Like when you guys get the prospect guide on March 10th, by the way, so pre-order now. But when the prospect guide goes out and you see a guy's score in that guide, the pre-draft guide, because then I update it the day that the draft ends. When you see that score, that's based on NFL mock draft database scores at that moment. So things will shift from March into April and stuff like that. And genuinely, this is what I want to stress. The scores don't change that dramatically from pre-draft to post-draft, aside from the Troy Franklin examples. And so I do wonder, though, if like those examples are ones that screw the model at the end of the day. I mean, it looks like the Troy Franklin one looked to be proper and correct, but there's other, and obviously the Andy Isabella example had the opposite effect because he went higher, or Tutu Atwell, they both went higher than anticipated. So I think it's something interesting. If anyone out there wants to dig into that or has that data available, I don't have like a database of all of that information. I think it'd be a really interesting thing to check out. This episode is sponsored by Underdog. I know the fantasy football season is over, but is it? Right now over on Underdog, you can join tons of best ball drafts for the 2025 season. And if you know that you have an edge with prospecting and free agency, you can really dominate these early contests. If you're new to the platform, if you sign up today, make sure to use promo code LATEROUND at sign up. That'll get you a nice deposit offer of up to $1,000 in site credit. That's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. Because I do want to talk about your amazing piece on the 2024 fantasy football takeaways. Because I did an episode on the running back renaissance, I called it, to start the offseason. That running back renaissance episode all stemmed from the idea that we had an insane year this season from RB2s at the end of the day. Why do you think that was? I saw that you saw the same thing in the data, that RB2s were just beastly in 2024. And then I think that, again, we want to look at this and not just describe what happened, but think about what could happen in the future. So why do you think that happened with RB2s this year? And then is that something that we should consider in 2025 happening again?
Yeah. So first I want to say that I listened to that episode kind of as I was working on this piece. And anytime I do that, JJ, and you give like a take like that, I'm like, oh my God, like I was gonna get to that by myself, maybe, or maybe I wouldn't. But now I'm like, I feel like I'm just coming to the same conclusion as JJ and copying JJ.
No.
But yeah. Anyway,
that.
So that was kind of my my thought process as I was building this. I just wanted to share. But yeah, I did come to a pretty similar conclusion as you did. That I think a lot of people in the industry have made at least some pretty interesting arguments about the league as a whole kind of changing, heavier personnel, being more involved in offenses. But mostly at the macro level, rushing efficiency was not that different in 2024 than we've seen over the past few years. Running backs were being used at the goal line about 11% more, just an 11% bump in goal line attempts from the previous few years. The conversion rates, though, fell a bit. Like, I kind of tried to dig into a lot of the different macro stuff of like, is running back just actually better from like an on-field football perspective right now? And I couldn't really find anything to support that. So yeah, clearly like the biggest factor to me then after failing to find anything else compelling was, I think just the health of the position and the injury rates is really what is mostly behind what we saw. So among the top 30 running backs by preseason ADP, 63% of them played at least 15 games, and that tied a 10-year high. If we compare that to the wide receiver position, it was only 50% of wide receivers drafted as top 30 receivers that made it to 15 games. That was a 10-year low. So really having those two things happen at the same time, I think really pushes up people's perception of the running backs. And also it's not just the perception, it is the reality that running back, especially RB2s, were a lot more productive and a lot deeper than we've ever really seen in recent history. But yeah, it's pretty easy, I think, to explain that in terms of, all of the good running backs in the league that are clear week one starters, most of them stayed healthy. Just the talent at the position overall was just a lot better than it is during a typical year. Also kind of helping with that is we have this 2017 running back draft class, man, that is still hanging around and also kind of inflating the talent and the depth of the position, right? Like I was giving lots of takes a year or so ago from now that like, oh man, we're all of these running backs from 2017, they're in year 8. This is like your Alvin Kamara's, your Christian McCaffrey's, Joe Mixon, so many, Aaron Jones, that entire draft class was insane. And not only were they elite and insane at the beginning of their careers, but most of them are still around and still maintaining these lead back workloads in the year 2024. And because of that, we just have more talent than we typically would. That draft class made up 4 of the top 20 fantasy running backs this year. The 2022 and 2023 classes had 4 running backs each in there. No other single year had more than 2. And if you kind of throw them in with like Derrick Henry plus Saquon Barkley right before and after them, a lot of the talent in the league is just thematically older right now than we've seen at different points over the last decade or so. So yes, I think that's part of the reason why we have so much depth, because we still have that special draft class hanging around. But like, it's going to go away at some point, right? Father Time is undefeated. So I think it's important to think about, right now the depth seems really good, but it will not always necessarily be that way.
Yeah, look, I mean, the end of the day, what you're speaking to when we talk about these RB2s having the seasons that they had, number one, you talk about just them being talented, them being good, right? But then on top of that, there's been the lack of injuries, which means when there's a lack of injury, that means that player who's talented is likely going to see more of a backfield share. And when he's seeing more of a backfield share, he's going to score more fantasy points. When you get an injury, we always talk about replaceability at running back and how, 0 RB is a little bit more feasible than a 0 wide receiver approach, because when wide receivers get injured, the guys who are stepping in are not automatically just, when Rashee Rice went down, they didn't just have, have some wide receivers step in and get Rashee Rice's workload because it's a more talent-driven position. Whereas at running back, it's more predictable. We know which guys are going to see that work because there's only one running back on the field at once. And also, especially the between the tackles stuff and running the ball, that side of things is a little bit more replaceable than the receiving aspect of football. And so when there's a lack of injury, that means you don't have those guys stepping in and getting work. But even the guys stepping in, they're not going to see, if Josh Jacobs went down, never was a backup in Green Bay going to see the exact same role that Josh Jacobs did. The idea is that maybe they could get 80% of where Josh Jacobs was or something like that. Maybe Jacobs is a bad example, but it's that idea that a backup running back won't get as many points as the starter would, but he can still give you a serviceable number of points that you don't need to invest in the position. That's where that whole idea of zero RB comes into play. And obviously that didn't happen much last year because there weren't many injuries. So a lot of the fantasy points were going to very, very few players, which then increases the RB2 pool. But you're talking about the 2017 class. I looked at my model. I would say that this 2024 class, or 2025 class rather, definitely not the 2024 class, this 2025 class at running back looks like a top 2 or 3 one since 2011. I mean, it looks really, really good on paper. And the question I have for you is that, obviously there's an influx in talent that's coming in. I think intuitively someone hearing that would say, oh, that means that RB2s are going to continue being great. But there's the counter argument to that a lot of these really, really good, talented running backs could land in backfields that are in some of the aged running back backfields, the Mixons of the world, whomever. Not to say that the Texans are going to go that route, but one of these running backs, and Aaron Jones, who's now a free, like what's going to happen with him, in 2025 when we do have this great draft class. So, do you think that's a reason to be concerned about the RB2s sustaining what they did last year? Do you think it's kind of a moot point, or do you think that because the talent is there, we're actually going to be able to sustain the RB2 stuff?
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about, and I agree it can kind of go a few different ways. So yeah, definitely the old guys could be the ones who kind of absorb all of this talent coming in. That can create committees, and it could just be an instant crash of like fantasy production no longer being concentrated into all of these like clear starters, these clear workhorses, right? Or the old guys could hang around for another year or two. A bunch of these new younger guys could come into their own backfields, and we could have an even bigger explosion of running back fantasy production, right? I can't sit here and tell you that with any confidence here in late February. But I do think it's important to think about like the different ways that can go. I always want to be, whenever I'm doing any sort of data analysis, I want to be thinking about behind it. What's driving this most of the time is just the overall talent profile of the running backs in the league or whatever, the players in the league, right? That's ultimately what's driving, there are all of these split backfields, or there are all RB2s were amazing this year, or whatever it is. I guess like one thing I will say is I talk about this with my Dynasty Points co-host, Jacob Sanderson, a lot, who you've had on here. Yeah. I think right now in the NFL, there are certain teams that really value the running back position a lot, and then certain teams that don't really value it at all. So like a good example here is last year, nobody would have looked at the Packers after they signed Josh Jacobs and expected that they would be one of the teams to draft a running back on day 2, right? Like you wouldn't just pick them out as the team that would do it. Or like Blake Corum, the Rams spending a day 2 pick on a guy that they ultimately aren't even going to play, right? Some of these teams just really value the running back position and want to have a lot of depth and want to have a lot of good players at it. And other teams don't. Like it was years that people have been saying, well, the Cowboys are going to draft a running back. The Cowboys are going to draft a running back. And it's Rico Dowdle that stumbles into a workload there in 2024, right? So when you have all these teams that really value it and a lot of teams that don't, the running back talent eventually in the league probably makes its way to the teams that do value it. And you go into the 2025 draft, if the teams on average that have good running backs value running backs the most, they're probably going to be the ones that are drafting the running backs, right? Especially if the gulf is so wide between teams that do and don't value it, that some teams just will never take a running back before day 3, then it could be kind of what you're saying of maybe a lot of these really elite prospects just end up behind a clear incumbent starter that is not going to be easy to push aside in year 1.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's almost inevitable that we'll get at least like one of these top 5-6 running backs or so going to a team that where they get Charbonnayed, right? Where they go to a team that has a Kenneth Walker type, or someone who's like maybe not S tier, like maybe not the absolute best, in the league. Like, I'd be pretty surprised if Atlanta goes really heavy, to get a running back. But if you're thinking about like the next tier down of running back, I think that there are teams that could go that route, and that's going to ruin someone. That's either going to ruin the incumbent, or it's going to ruin the guy that the prospect that we love, right? And it's unfortunate, but that's just kind of when you have enough talent to go around, that's just how things kind of break at times. This isn't really related to anything that we were going to be talking about, but one of the things that I think in Dynasty that you can win from a market perspective is typically just going against the grain with what the market is assuming at the running back position with a team, right? So like, I go back to a handful of years ago, I remember talking about Atlanta when they didn't draft a running back, didn't do anything at the position when Mike Davis was their starter. Now, I didn't like Mike Davis that year, but if you had Mike Davis and you spent literally nothing to get him right before the draft, you at least got that addition in value pre and post draft, and then you could flip them, and then you could do something. You're gaining value. That's the name of the game. It's not about getting production in the offseason, because that's impossible. We're looking just for value gains. And I think a way to do that is by looking at the market and saying, where are there backfields that people are kind of assuming, another player is going to take over and be a pretty big asset in that backfield. I mean, you could maybe see an example off the top of my head being like Jaylen Warren in Pittsburgh, where people are just making the assumption that they're going to spend, do the Najee Harris thing again and, spend a first rounder on a back. I know Ashton Genty was just mocked to them by Jeremiah earlier this week. That's all very possible. Like, this is just playing probability from the perspective that, chances are with Warren, the Steelers are probably going to get, let's just say, like a mid to late day 2 pick, maybe even an early day 3 pick because the class is so deep. And Jaylen Warren's a capable pass catcher who can still be valuable in a split backfield, right? So to me, like, he's one of those guys that might be a little bit safe with this class coming in. But of course, if they go out and get Ashton Genty, then he's screwed. But you're just playing the probability game a little bit from that perspective. Do you tend to do that with your teams, with your dynasty rosters, where you're kind of looking at backfields and saying like you look at like Jacksonville right now, where Liam Cohen stepping in. He obviously did what he did with Bucky Irving last year. He was giving. I saw you actually sent a tweet about this, I think today, talking about how he just gave the explosive back more work, which is what we want these coaches to do. But now you get Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby. Out of those two, I don't know which one is necessarily the most explosive on the ground, but I think that Etienne's been the more capable pass catcher. But is that a team that is realistically going to go after a running back? Maybe, because Etienne's contract's coming up, but maybe they don't. And if they don't, like, they're a team that is at least a candidate to not go after a high-end running back, and therefore those running backs would be safer, like from a value perspective. Do you think about that kind of stuff whenever you're managing your rosters?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Jaguars as the example, because that's been on my sort of mind today. We do this thing in Dynasty where, like, through the first half of 2024, the prices on Tank Bigsby were insane. People were saying you have to go out and get Tank Bigsby. Oh my God, yeah. He's so explosive. Like, he's the next running back breakout here. And now you fast forward to now, and it's like, okay, yeah, Bigsby's rushing metrics on the ground mostly blew out Travis Etienne's last year. You can say that he was playing hurt for a lot of the season. You can say that Bigsby has never shown an ability to be a pass catcher in the NFL. He had like 2 games above a 20% route share or something like that, just not, even with Etienne being out. So yeah, obvious concerns outside of, well, they could both just get replaced by a running back in the draft. But yeah, I think now we're sitting here, and just because the draft is like right in front of us, I think everybody is quick to write off like the Tank Bigsby's, where it's like, well, no, guys, that was like the whole thesis is maybe an explosive player is going to take over a backfield. Now you can make that bet at a lower cost. You can get him for like a late second or an early third. People want to be selling these running backs right now. So yeah, I mean, why not? It is an obvious risk, but yeah, that's something that you can make a profit on and turn around and sell after the draft if it works out. But kind of to that point, I try not to run my dynasty teams quite in that way, because while yes, I think you absolutely can kind of profit by dealing in information in the offseason like that, especially if you're really plugged in like we are. It's something I have a hard time recommending other people do, because for one, most dynasty leagues are not as active as we seem to think, or as the leagues that we as analysts will play in, right? I think most people are in one or two dynasty leagues, maybe with like a bunch of their friends, probably not a lot of activity happening like right before the draft. Things usually will flare up around like rookie draft season, but you don't always have the liquidity to move off of a player at like a small profit if you don't like the player as a long-term bet, right? So I just think it's important to like make that clear that while that strategy can work, like you have to understand your league and your capabilities as a manager. Are you going to be that active enough and able to get those types of deals done to even take advantage of it in practice?
Yeah, it's not day trading for the majority of people. You know, like you can't just like get an asset, flip them immediately, keep flipping, go. You know, a lot of it is hypothetical talk, and that's what I love about your content is that, and I try to do the same with mine, is that we can say what we want and make these hypotheticals. And, you know, I like the Mike Davis one was an actionable thing because I felt strongly about it, but just saying that there will be backfields that, you know, that aren't interrupted and that will sustain value and gain value after the draft because it's being baked in right now that someone's going to be added to it. I do think that it's important to at least dive into that a little bit more. And probably if you're in a league, like you said, that isn't as interactive, to get a running back that would or to find a backfield and to find the backfield was probably a little bit more difficult than one that you can just constantly be flipping and trying to gain value at. That's a really good point to add. Let's move on to wide receivers. I haven't done an episode on wideouts. I plan on doing it probably once the prospect guide's out. I just want to really get the running back one out there because I think that running backs had probably the most interesting season of any of the big four positions in fantasy this past year. But with wide receivers, did they seem to produce differently this year that you found? And what do you think that means for higher end wideouts in 2025?
Yeah. So I like in my key takeaways article, I really like to dig into kind of value over replacement, right? And just my way of calculating that is how many fantasy points per game are you providing over like the baseline player at your position? So with wide receivers, I will just go like the through wide receiver 20, right? Like let's say that's the baseline. This year, there was only really one high-end elite wide receiver that is giving you a lot of fantasy points over that baseline. It was Jamar Chase, right? 9.1 fantasy points per game over the replacement, right? But looking back to the last couple years in 2022, there were 6 wide receivers that were giving you over a 5 fantasy point per game advantage over the baseline, right? In 2023, there were 5 receivers, right? So, I will say those 2 years were 2 of the better wide receiver years that we'd had in the last decade and change. But again, going back to like the talent discussion we were having, we had just had some really good wide receiver draft classes over the last 5 years, especially just kind of in general. So that made sense to some extent. It came crashing down this year. And I think, again, just like at the running back position, a lot of the story can kind of be told by just injury rates year to year, right? So I already said that it was decade worst result in terms of wide receivers staying healthy. But we just saw pretty much exactly the same thing happen with the quarterback position in 2023 and then going into 2024, right? In 2023, only 53% of top 15 QBs got to 15 games played. And we were having kind of a similar conversation of like, oh, wow, the quarterback position just in general kind of sucked in 2023. Mm-hmm. And we were sitting here saying, well, what does this mean for the early round and late round quarterback strategies and everything? But as it turned out, in 2024, everything just kind of went back to normal for them, right? 80% of top 15 QBs this year made it to 15 games, and nobody was complaining about quarterback production in fantasy this year, right?
Unless they drafted a lot of Dak Prescott in their best ball drafts,
exactly, yeah, and that might have been me as well, but yeah, there plenty of high end producers, plenty of late round guys, but it was quarterback staying healthy that kind of just 100%. Made us forget about that immediately, right? So just zooming out at the receiver position, I kind of want to be in the same mindset of what we saw last year was very much like on the low end of outcomes for the receiver position as a whole. I mean, among like the top 20, these are the guys that missed at least 5 games. It was Puka Nacua, T. Higgins, Nico Collins, both Eagles receivers, and Stephon Diggs. Obviously, you had Rashee Rice and Chris Godwin both scoring at top 3 rates at the position before they had season-ending injuries very early. So just with like a kind of a turnaround in injury fortunes, it's really easy to see how we could have had 4 or 5 or 6 guys really providing that elite production on a week-to-week basis at the receiver position. I don't think I want to... I think it's really important in fantasy to not like just chase last year's macro results. Like I feel like every offseason we kind of have like the 0 RB versus like the robust RB or hero RB debate. And very often people's justifications kind of come down to, well, this worked last year, but like what worked 2 years ago? What worked 5 years ago? Like every year is like its own special snowflake. Like I don't want to just be over indexing to the most recent outcome. Because it all just ties in with the randomness of injury rates, the differing talent profiles at each position. I think people kind of become very reactive, and I try not to do that.
Yeah. I also think that people overstate the differences of like trends from one year to the next in terms of like what a draft looks like, right? Like you're going to see, like this past year, we saw more wide receivers getting drafted early than running backs, like more than we saw the previous year, more than the previous year. But oftentimes when we look at that analysis, we say, well, back in 2012, this is what it looked like. It's like, okay, but we're not going from 2012 to now. We're going from 2023 to 2024 and then 2024 to 2025. And when you're reacting based on that, the changes really aren't that dramatic. They're not nearly as big as people were like, oh, last year we had to go robust RB. This year we go 0 RB. It's like you probably don't have to make that big, that drastic of a change year over year, which is why I mean, in my opinion, all the research I've ever done has pointed, especially in like a full PPR, flex league with 3 wide receiver starts. Like to me, a hero RB approach generally is what the data screams at me when you look at multiple seasons, like across, like you're saying, instead of just looking at this like micro, what happened last year, when you look at the last 5, 7, 8, 9 years, that's what screams to me as like the optimal approach that is at least safe, right? Like you're not going to necessarily completely screw up your team if you go with more of that approach with that kind of format. And then you kind of adjust and tweak based on the format, based on what market trends are generally saying. But again, it just goes back to what you're kind of saying. It's like, let's not overreact the way that we overreact. I think that oftentimes you're better off like finding, I don't want to say going down the route of let's just pick the right guys, because I think that strategy is still unbelievably important in fantasy football. But I think finding tools and strategies to get to that conclusion of getting the right players based on market trends, based on talent profiles, all that, and all the stuff that we could analyze, like that's becoming just as important, and it is just as important as understanding that strategic side. It's everything, right? So I know that I'm rambling a little bit, but I do think that what you're saying is very correct in that people tend to really overstate and overrate what happened strategically the previous season, and then almost having to do a 180 from that into the following year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure I have much else to add to that. Yeah, I think it's just, it becomes, I think people live in like the Twitter narratives, I guess, more so than they do in like the actual, the actual ADPs and the results, because it can't be the case, right? Even if zero RB is like the most popular thing that we're talking about on the internet going into the 2024 season, it's not possible that every team is a zero RB team, right?
Especially when you look at ADP, it's definitely not happening, Yeah, exactly.
So it's not like going into 2025. Yeah, we should be doing our analysis based on the market prices of 2025, not based on, like the zero RB or like the wide receiver people were wrong last year. Like I think that's like I try to stay like very grounded in what's like in front of me, rather than, these people, or this thought was wrong before, or this thought was right before, and like pattern matching. Yeah,
and I don't want to be I think that there's like, if you were to choose one of two paths, which is do what people are saying they did the previous year, or be the contrarian and go the complete opposite. Probably be the contrarian from a strategic perspective is probably the better choice in terms of being optimal in that season. But my point, I think your point too, is you don't need to go so far in the one direction and then all of a sudden just like completely change your way of drafting every year. Like I said, I mean, if you have a pretty consistent way of doing like, like basically, and this is a good segue to get into quarterbacks. Quarterback, one thing that I noticed in 2019 after Lamar Jackson did what he did was that people were catching on. People were understanding that mobile quarterbacks were important. And I saw it in the ADP data. And it was very obvious that the late round quarterback strategy was becoming more of like, could it become a middle round quarterback strategy, or could it be, what's it going to look like? I wasn't saying like, this is exactly how it's going to go down. It was more so I wrote an article like questioning the late round quarterback strategy because people were valuing the right things finally at the quarterback position. I think Lamar Jackson really brought that to the forefront. So my question to you, after looking at 2024 data and saying what we just said about being reactive to the previous season, what do you think is going to happen moving forward? And should people start adopting more of an early round quarterback strategy than they have in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say this to start out. Yeah, the early round quarterback strategy over the last few years, not just 1 year, but a sample of the last 3 or so years, has been very, very successful, just objectively, right? So one metric I really like to track is the rate of a player making it into the ESPN playoffs, like in ESPN leagues, right? Because ESPN publishes this data every year. I just think it's really useful to be able to look and say, oh, okay, like Jamar Chase was on 72% of ESPN playoff rosters this year. That's really good. He was a very plus EV pick, right?
And it's a data set that's showing you at least how people interact with their teams, not just the static number that we're analyzing and saying, oh, he was this many points better than this guy.
Exactly. Yeah. It just brings in like the reality of were they helping people make the playoffs or win fantasy leagues, right? So in this key takeaways article every year, I just kind of and this was originally a Scott Barrett thing. I need to give Scott more credit for a lot of things that I say. So this is originally is a Scott Barrett invention, I believe. Over a 55% rate of making the ESPN playoffs is just designated as like a league winning player, right? That's just like the cutoff that we pick. All 5 of the league winning quarterbacks by that method over the past 2 seasons were drafted inside the first 4 rounds. It was Josh Allen both years, Jalen Hurts both years, and Lamar Jackson, right? And it's very interesting because kind of right in that period of time you were talking about, maybe we need to start questioning the late round quarterback strategy and we saw the ADP shifting, we saw the results shift in terms of which strategy is winning people leagues and getting to them to the playoffs, right? From 2017 to 2021, there were no league-winning quarterbacks drafted inside the first 4 rounds. There have been 7 since 2022 over the last 3 years. And yeah, as you said, it's because people and the market have correctly recognized that these hypermobile dual threat QBs are not only much more predictable in their fantasy scoring, but also that they're pricing in that upside a little bit better. And even at those elevated prices, we've seen the Josh Allens and the Lamar Jacksons deliver those really high, like league winning playoff rates, right? So yeah, I think you should be open to adopting an early round quarterback strategy if we flip over the page into 2025 and those Allens and Jacksons are again available in your round 3s, your round 4s. Because yeah, we've seen these guys for multiple years deliver massively plus EV seasons at that cost. So yeah, I would be happy to just start doing that. It's always going to be dependent on the talent at other positions, right? In that given year, there's always an opportunity cost that we have to understand, but yeah, if you said, Ryan, like you have to point to a player that is most likely to make like your league winner status next year. Yeah, if I have to pick an individual one, I'm probably first going to be looking at those hypermobile quarterbacks. Maybe you're not winning as big as if you're instead drafting a running back in the 3rd round that goes on to be a huge league winner and makes it on like 70% of playoff rosters. But I just in terms of predictability, I think we have a few years at this point that, drafting these quarterbacks fairly early is a good thing in fantasy football.
Yeah. One thing that I've stressed too in the draft guide over the last couple of years is, going back to we can still look at these like multi-year trends to say, yeah, hero RB is probably an optimal choice if you want to play it safe, right? If you want to have like a general guideline instead of like, really like let's say that you completely forget to do any research for 2025 right before your draft. Okay, just go 0 RB. And then the other thing that I would say, hero RB, not 0 RB. And then the other thing I would say is in a typical 12-team league, when you get into the middle of round 3, that's typically when you start to see the drop off at running back, when you start to see the drop off at wide receiver a little bit. It's basically when you get into RB2 and wide receiver 2 range, right? Generally speaking. And there's a slightly bigger drop off at running back. That's the opportunity cost side that you're talking about, where that's easily where you can slot in some of these elite quarterbacks and feel fine about it because you're getting that upside and that edge at quarterback while also not sacrificing the massive downside that you would be getting if you do forego the chance to have a true league winning player at running back. So, look, people think like even to this day, they're like, oh my gosh, you're talking about early round. I've been talking about early round quarterbacks for like 6 years, guys. Like it's not a new, I just kept the moniker just for the fun of it. But early round quarterbacking, when you have guys like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, these dual threat players, it's a very, very viable thing, if not an optimal thing at this point. But we are still going to be in positions to draft late round quarterbacks. We kind of had one this year in Jaden Daniels, if you want to consider him a late round quarterback, but we also had some pocket passers that ended up doing well. And we're going to have a turnover in pocket passer production every year where 1 or 2 of these late round pocket passers will have somewhat of an outlier season in touchdown rate. They will become usable in fantasy as a result of that. But you wrote about something really, really interesting about late round quarterbacks in your write-up, and I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So it used to be the case where, late round quarterback, easy, draft the guy that runs and log out, right? That used to be something you could just do in the market.
Still, if you can do it, then do it, but it just can't happen. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. If there's a Jaden Daniels there available outside of the top 100, you should probably be drafting a lot of Jaden Daniels. Yeah, absolutely. Would not say that that's a bad idea. But because the market has kind of pushed up a lot of these viable hypermobile quarterbacks into the earlier and middle rounds, yeah, we're kind of left to pick through all of the pocket passers. And as you said, just one of the biggest factors in a fantasy relevant season out of a pocket passer is, okay, who's going to have a really high touchdown rate this year? That's kind of
right.
Unfortunately what it comes down to, right? And that is harder to predict, but there are like some patterns that we can see, especially over the last few years. So dropping down to a 45% ESPN playoff rate, so still like a very good selection, maybe not quite single-handedly winning you your league, but still pretty damn good. If we just look at the quarterbacks from the last 4 years that fit that, at least a 45% ESPN playoff rate, you've got two hypermobile guys. You've got Jaden Daniels and you have Justin Fields in 2022. But the rest of the list, CJ Stroud, Matt Stafford 2021, Baker Mayfield this year, Brock Purdy in 2023, Tua in 2022. The very clear like connective tissue between all of these guys is the type of system that they're in and their play caller, right? Every single one of those guys that I just listed off had a play caller from the Kyle Shanahan or Sean McVay coaching tree. I just collectively refer to it as the McShanahan tree. A McShanahan play caller is what you want. And if we look at the top 12 quarterbacks from 2024 by fantasy points per dropback, which is one of the more predictive stats we have at the QB position, it's literally the four hypermobile guys, Lamar, Allen, Hurts, and Jaden Daniels, Ben Johnson's quarterback, and then 7 pocket passers in these McShanahan systems. Like you just had Sam Darnold putting up an insane year, which is funny compared to the thoughts of Sam Darnold heading into the season, right? So if these play callers that we can clearly identify are the ones that have an edge on what the league is doing defensively right now, and seemingly the only ones that have an edge there, why are we not just drafting all of the cheapest pocket passers that are in those systems? Like just going into 2025, I think Trevor Lawrence is like going to be left for dead. He gets Liam Cohn, who just put together that season out of Baker Mayfield, right? JJ McCarthy is probably going to be drafted later than Sam Darnold finished last year. Why can Kevin O'Connell not just, even if you don't think JJ McCarthy is an amazing prospect or whatever, why would he fail in this Kevin O'Connell system that we have seen Sam Darnold be amazing? We've seen Josh Dobbs and Nick Mullins put up startable quarterback like QB1 fantasy numbers in this. So yeah, that's like a really I think when I'm looking at later round quarterbacks in 2025, that's going to be the first thing I'm thinking about is which system are they in, and are they in the system that has generated all of the most productive fantasy pocket passers in the last few years.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a lot of actionable information that you just threw at folks. Awesome stuff. It was great chatting with you, Ryan. Let everyone know where they can find you and what you've been working on.
Yeah, you can find me on X at RyanJ_Heath. And then all of my written work is over at fantasypoints.com. Right now, working on an article kind of breaking down both draft capital and combine metrics and how those kind of interact and what we can do to maybe try to beat the NFL in terms of what are better ways to look at some of these metrics for fantasy football. Just kind of updating all of our athleticism models at Fantasy Points. It's going to be a really cool article that will be dropping a few days before the combine. So definitely go check that out if you're interested.
Yeah, highly recommended by me. As always, guys, check out lateround.com. Make sure you are pre-ordering that prospect guide. It will go up by $5. The price will on March 10th when it launches. Now, usually I end the show by saying thanks for tuning in, but earlier this week in Pittsburgh, one of the Penguins broadcasters, folks may or may not know who he is, Mike Lang, passed away. He was 76 years old. He had a profound impact on my life, even just from a nostalgic perspective, right? Because he was just in my ears growing up in Pittsburgh forever. And he's the one who's got all of these one-liners that so many people outside of Pittsburgh have probably heard in their lifetime. But at the end of every Pittsburgh Penguins home win, he would say the same phrase. And that was, ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has just left the building.